Good evening, everyone. My name is Rinka Stahuljak. I'm professor of comparative literature and French, and director of the Center for Early Global Studies, or CMRS CEGS, that was founded in 1963 as Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, but is now known as CMRS, Center for Early Global Studies. The center has long promoted and sustained transdisciplinary studies of the period from late antiquity to the early modern era. But since 2019, and this was also the motivation for the update to our name, since 2019, Center's interests spatially cover the globe, making connections true to the time period. And in order for us to structure the polyvalent and multifaceted inquiry of the center's diverse faculty who study various areas of the globe, we adopted 5 research axes. They are sustainability, repurposing, fluidity, permanence, bodies, performance, conversion, mobility, communication, archive. Organized neither spatially nor temporally, but methodologically, the 5 research axes operate in line with CMRS CEGS's commitment to approach all areas of the world as equally epistemologically and methodologically productive, including those that have been underrepresented or understudied. Methodological connections and disciplinary intersections place unconnected parts of the world into dialogue, while they also give us a basis to contrast the knowledge of the unconnected worlds with the parallel and slow emergence of a pre-modern and early modern connected world system that begins in the periods under the purview of the center. And since we are talking about connections, I wanted to just remind you that we started this new book Salon series last academic year to be mindful of our own on-site connections and relationships in pandemic times. And we are continuing it this year, and we're continuing it on Zoom for now in order to continue presenting work from within our community to the larger community here on campus. So I'm very thankful to our 2 discussants this evening, whose work each in their way advances CMRS CEGS's commitment to its position of a research center dedicated to the study of the early worlds of the Americas. And this is then for me the moment to say that CMRS CEGS also respectfully acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukwetam, Ahihirom, and Eyohimkem, past, present, and emerging. CARLA Pestana is Distinguished Professor, Joyce Appleby Endowed Chair of America in the World, and Department Chair in the History Department. Trained as an early American historian at UCLA, she began her research career in New England, working on religious radicals in colonial Massachusetts. Since then, she has worked in the Caribbean and the Atlantic more generally, with works on the English Atlantic in an Age of Revolution, 1640-1661, the Protestant Empire, Religion in the Making of the British Atlantic World, and the English Conquest of Jamaica, Oliver Cromwell's Bid for Empire. With Sharon Salinger, she edited a 4-volume collection of texts, The Early English Caribbean, 1570-1700, and with Aliga Gold and Paul Mapp, the forthcoming volume, Cambridge History of America and the World. But with this book that we will be talking about today, The World of Plymouth Plantation, the focus, her focus was to return to New England. She's joined this evening by ALEX MAZZAFERRO, assistant professor in the English department at UCLA, and a scholar of early American literature. Alex works at the intersection of the history of science and the history of political thought. His current book project rewrites the history of American colonialism in light of the fact that innovation was a forbidden activity and a pejorative synonym for rebellion in the early modern period. Tracking the emergence of settlements throughout English North America and the Caribbean and the various forms of resistance that contested them, he argues that colonial elites rehabilitated and then monopolized the right to innovate by applying the empirical methods of natural science to politics. I'm grateful to Alex for interrupting his Huntington Library Fellowship to join us for what will be a fascinating conversation about the world of the plantation with turkeys, stockings, and much more. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Zmeka. I also want to thank Aaron Romo for getting us organized at this event and all of you for attending. This is a great turnout. So it is my great pleasure to serve as the discussant at this long overdue salon for my colleague Carla Pestana's new book, The World of Plymouth Plantation, published by Harvard University Press last year. As Carla has jokingly pointed out, it only figures that the one time she's written a book cued to a major historical anniversary, all of its accompanying publicity events have had to be rescheduled. But I want to begin today by suggesting that this delay might actually be fitting in at least two ways. First, while we are indeed a year late in commemorating the 400th anniversary of the 1620 founding of Plymouth Plantation, we are right on schedule this week in commemorating an equally outsized event in the colony's history, the first Thanksgiving, celebrated in 1621. Yet I think Carla's book discourages us from straining after such historical consolations. In her telling, the first Thanksgiving, like so many other touchstones of Plymouth history, is revealed to have had a remarkably different significance for its participants than it does for us today. And this encourages a healthy skepticism of centenary anniversaries generally, whose promise of neat calendrical symmetry has so often been pressed into the service of national myth-making. In other words, the fact that our various commemorations of Plymouth were knocked off rhythm this time around is a kindred expression of what we might call Carla's gentle iconoclasm. The second way that the delayed celebration of Carla's wonderful book seems fitting has to do with the cause of that delay, not just a pandemic, but a global pandemic. The pandemic's geographic reach speaks to the book's first major intervention, returning Plymouth to the Atlantic and global context that have been obscured by its mythic depiction as an isolated political and theological experiment that is meaningful only as the incubator of the future United States. As a site of profound human mobility, a modest commercial crossroads, and a staging ground for key political and religious debates, Carla's Plymouth resembles our own world in its privileging of circulation, exchange, and interconnection. The word world in Carla's title signifies in two interrelated ways. First, in the sense of global that I have just described, but also in a second sense of the everyday world the colonists lived in. The book's second intervention then is its claim that that quotidian world has been overshadowed by a handful of vignettes that have become larger than life in the popular imagination. The Mayflower Compact, the implausible landing at Plymouth Rock, the colonists meeting with the Anglophone indigenous Patuxet man we know today as Squanto, and of course, the first Thanksgiving. In Carla's hands, these well-worn stories are not just retold, but resituated alongside a host of understudied ones. And doing so allows her to recover the centrality of women, investors, mariners, traders, visitors, wanderers, servants, privateers, of guns, tobacco, beaver pelts, domesticated animals, clothing, and books, and ideas about kingship, ecclesiology, sexuality, Native American religious conversion, and the recreation of English lifeways. Guided by this dual investment in the global and the everyday, which allows us to enter into the Plymouth colonist world and to see how it was embedded in a much larger one, Carla's compelling account estranges one of early America's most familiar histories. So rather than being timed to coincide with Plymouth's quadricentennial, the book seizes this otherwise arbitrary anniversary as an occasion to reimagine the colony's significance. Today, Carla writes, most of us see the plantation not as a real place in which people lived, worked, and died, but only as a symbol of large abstract concepts. Those concepts include notions of collective self-reinvention, participatory democracy, and religious freedom. But Carla shows that those ideas took very different shape in the 17th century than they later would, and that they have often obscured the financial and legal precarity, Native American dispossession, gender hierarchy, harsh labor regimes, and commercial ties to Atlantic slavery that also defined Plymouth. Diminishing Plymouth's importance to the eventual United States while recovering its place as one colony among many in a newly connected world. This is the core of Carla's gentle iconoclasm. She dismantles the myths about Plymouth while revisiting the archive with fresh eyes to tell a new story that upholds even as it reconfigures the colony's historical significance. Elegantly shuttling between microscopic attention to its everyday details and macroscopic attention to its broader context, the World of Plymouth Plantation tells a timely story suited to our own untimely global times. So thanks so much for being here, Carla, and thanks in advance for sharing your thoughts about this work with us. I have a few questions for you, which are really just prompts to get us talking, and then we're going to open things up to audience questions. So I thought I would begin by simply asking what brought you to the project and what it was like to write a book geared toward a more popular audience, one with far fewer footnotes, and an audience that believes they know the story already, even though you argue that they don't really know it. So what was that experience like?
Well, before I answer your question, let me first of all say thank you for your really generous reading of the book. It's so nice to have smart people read what we write and then describe it in a way that it sounds even smarter. So thank you. And also thanks to Zrinka for the invitation and Aaron for managing us here. So a friend of mine who actually might be here tonight, Michael Morantz, said to me that this should have been my second book, because I started in Plymouth, I started in New England, and then instead of doing something about New England that took a different angle and did it more broadly or whatever, I like wandered away and did other things. And then, years later and multiple books later, I came back to New England. I'd been thinking a lot about kind of the connections and people moving around and ideas for decades in my work on the Atlantic, and bringing that sensibility to a meeting I went to at Plymouth, what was then called Plymouth Plantation, the historical reenactment village site, of which I have a picture here, which they provided to me. It's now called Plymouth Pawtuxet, but the Plymouth Plantation people invited me to come and help them because they had an NEH grant and they wanted to once again rethink what they were doing in terms of interpreting the history there. And I was brought in, as it turned out, to have insight about Quakerism, which is one of my specializations. But I, of course, went to all the meetings and participated in all the discussions. And it just got me thinking about how we conceive of Plymouth as an isolated place. We think of these people as arriving here and then, they meet a native man, but otherwise they're all alone in this harsh environment. And a lot of the heroic narrative about, the suffering and the tribulation, et cetera, has, emphasizes that isolation. And I thought, that's so counterintuitive to what I think I know about what's going on in this, even as early as 1620, that what if you thought about it as, from a very different angle? So I basically brought my understanding of how Plymouth is normally talked about to my, newer understanding of how this world is changing, and the English and other Europeans are getting more and more involved in these American locations and creating interconnections that are, going to impact any area that these people go. So that was kind of how I became interested. And then it occurred to me, oh, it's an anniversary. I could write an anniversary book. But you've already remarked on how that worked out. So
that's great. Yeah, I mean, it's in many ways such an obvious version of the story to historians, but not to the wider public. So I think it's a really important book for people to understand that, especially as the world we live in resembles that world. It's sort of the origin of that sense of interconnectedness that gives you, a pandemic or like global change or something. Yeah, wonderful. So I have a question about the book's structure. Rather than focusing on those larger than life vignettes that I mentioned earlier, you've devised this really inventive way to organize the book. So I wanted to invite you to talk us through the way the chapters are structured, and how this allowed you to tell new stories that reveal that everyday Plymouth. And in particular, I'm interested to hear how this approach sort of freed you up to move beyond linear narration a bit, that kind of plotting annals mode of the Bradford of Plymouth Plantation text, and to circle back to events that you'd already mentioned earlier in the book in order to describe them in greater detail or from a new angle.
So I always find how to organize a book to be the trickiest, kind of most persistent question, like I always play around with that. So this one was no different. But I knew a few things going into working on this project. I knew I wanted to kind of limit the research to the first decade or so, first couple decades. I wanted to write it so that it would be accessible to non-academics. And I wanted to emphasize the connections. And so I started going through the sources, and Plymouth, for a very early English colonization attempt, is, has more than the usual amount of sources written about it from a variety of angles. And so that was very helpful. So I went through, not only the narratives and of course of Plymouth Plantation, but also whatever, legal or law record, court records, that kind of thing that existed for that early period. And as I did it, I just kept notes to myself about connections, like anything that seemed to me to nod toward or give evidence of a connection. And I ended up with pages and pages and pages of, my handwriting saying, servants, look at this page, tobacco, look at this page. So then after I had done that, I just started sorting, and it quickly occurred to me that if you think of this from an Atlantic history angle, connections are a key way to organize. And if you thought about big categories for doing that, things, people, and ideas made sense. And so I just started sorting. If I sorted things, if I could do that, could I talk about the things I wanted to discuss using that kind of three-part organization? And so that was working pretty well. There were some things I had to lose, but that was going to happen no matter what. But then I thought, to read a whole section on things, like have it be part one things, part two people, it seemed to me in a way sort of boring. And also I thought, especially the ideas part might get us away from what a popular audience would be willing to sort of slog through. So that's when I got the idea to sort of cycle through, do one of each, do a thing, a person, an idea, a thing, a person, an idea. So I sorted that. And then the really hard part, and I'm not positive about the results I came up with, was how do you then decide how you put them together and what order you put them in. And so that was really tricky. And I played around with that a lot. But I decided, at least in my own mind, I thought, what if you take the most basic thing? Like, what is the most obvious, basic, foundational thing? And use that as the first section and then work out from there. So the most obvious category of people, the most basic idea. And so that's what I ended up doing. So I pictured it kind of like rings moving out from a center, even though that doesn't entirely make sense. And that's how I ended up doing it. So I cycle through, I think there's 18 chapters, but they're short. And they cycle through these little triptychs of the three categories moving out. I started with wives because it seemed really important to me that Plymouth came with families right away, and that really shaped what was going on here. Lots of other early efforts were men coming for sort of quasi, either trade or kind of quasi-military interventions. And if you bring families, you're saying something completely different about what you're doing. So wives were the first thing. And then I just went from there, going, kind of out from there. So it's what I ended up coming up with. And I think it works in the kind of general sense that it's better to intersperse them. But other than that, I'm not sure, I hope it works.
I think it works great. Yeah, it's sort of like, it's not quite concentric circles, but it's more like a network. It's like these things that aren't related to each other in a precise way. They're just all kind of sitting there, and there are these lines connecting them so that the order ceases to matter quite so much. You're able to tell stories again or out of order, but we know kind of where we are at all times.
And
So just to
the other thing I
yeah.
did was, and I didn't mention this before, but I think this kind of gets to a comment you made, is I started each one with a story, with what could be a little vignette. Because one thing I was thinking as I did the research is there's lots of stories that Plymouth generates that we don't know,
Yeah.
that we don't pay attention to, because they didn't get selected in the late 18th and in the early 19th century as the important iconic stories. So we've got those 4 or 5 that we repeat over and over, but you could as easily talk about a chicken making its way to a native village, or, you know, a pair of red stockings, or whatever, you know, if that had seemed somehow more significant in the early writings about Plymouth.
Right.
So
And you make it significant. The stocking story is a great one. It's like this burst of color in a black and white image in my head of Plymouth in this like Wizard of Oz moment when suddenly there's these red stockings that a man has been wearing, and his neighbors say he didn't own those before, and he's brought before the magistrates to figure out how he got them, and he's turned out to have stolen them. So there's so many great stories like that. Again, you're getting to take a second look at this archive that is so well traveled, but there's so much great stuff in there that people didn't happen to pick out as significant. But then what you do with it is to say, well, this lets us talk about cloth and trade and the scarcity of clothing in Plymouth and the way that it relies on other places, and its participation in the fur trade is sort of part of that exchange to get other things that they need. So I think that's really a great kind of entry point. The wives is a similarly great point of entry into the book, because they signify the kind of ambition of permanence of settler colonialism, right? You do this great thing where you describe how they, on the one hand, seem innocuous because men who bring their families are maybe a little bit less likely to go to war with you from a native perspective, but they also signify that intention to stay, which is in the long term much more hostile, right?
right. The impact of that is really major, from, you know, on the native experience of having them there.
Yeah. So just to recap for folks that haven't gotten a look at the table of contents, each of the 6 chapters has 3 sections that deal with a group of people, an object or a set of objects, and an idea. And that allows Carla to cycle through these different things without getting stuck in one kind of mode at once. So maybe I'll ask one more question, because pointing out that we're going to move in a moment to the audience questions. Let's see which one works best here. So you use a number of concepts to kind of convey Plymouth's global embeddedness, separatism, monarchism, trade, book publishing, servitude. But one that stood out to me in particular was mobility. You point out that accounts of Plymouth that depict it as the origin of the United States kind of falsely imply that every colonist had the same emigration itinerary by way of Holland as the Mayflower arrivals, like William Bradford or someone like that. And you observe that this approach has led us to overlook individuals who arrive later, who leave Plymouth, or who just visit briefly. So how does mobility kind of help you in this book to unlock new insights? And if there are any examples that come to mind of important figures who kind of exemplify that, that'd be great to hear too.
Yeah, well, I opened that that section talking about the meeting between Squanto and Edward Winslow, because both of them are very well-traveled individuals. The native man had already been to Spain and England and Newfoundland and come back to Massachusetts, and the Englishman had been from England, from his own village in England, into London, to the Netherlands, to New England, and then he would then go back and forth across the Atlantic multiple times, and finally ended up dying in the Caribbean. So, you know, those are kind of examples of, I mean, and Winslow is somebody who's very much associated with the colony and is understood to be, you know, he was a governor, he's very much associated with Plymouth, but in fact, he in the end doesn't even make his, you know, he doesn't live there in the later part of his life. He leaves his family there, but he does not, he relocates to London and is there for years, very involved in the revolutionary government before he goes on the Western design and tries to participate in this effort to take the Spanish Americas away from Spain. So you know, he's the only portrait we have of a contemporary portrait we have of a participant who was on the Mayflower. And in fact, he doesn't even make the long-term commitment that, you know, our narratives of Plymouth would lead you to expect. So, you know, and those are just two examples. And then there are many other traders, visitors. The kind of 17th century version of tourists come just to check out the colony, like to say, oh, there's people here, let me, you know, stop in and check it out and write some letters about what I found. And, you know, so there's lots of people coming and going all the time. It's, you know, fisher folk are coming down from the fishing grounds to the north. Native peoples are in and out. You know, there's all kinds of people moving around all the time. So it's actually, once I started thinking about it, you know, it's not an isolated village. It's a very busy place at a kind of, you know, it's hidden away the way where it is, you know, in the kind of hook of Cape Cod, but it's a place that a lot of people go out of their way to come to because those people are there. The first, you know, known group of long-term English settlers in the region. So
yeah, a lot of surprises there. The tourists in particular, since it's such a dangerous journey, just to go have a look around and then head home. And the other one that you didn't mention is the privateers who briefly stay over there, which is I had never heard of. So
yeah, that stretched me a little beyond the first 2 decades, but I couldn't resist. There's such great descriptions of those men, you know, drunkenly spending their money in Plymouth and how shocking that is. And
setting a bad example. Yeah. And you totally took the follow-up example I was going to ask for, which was Winslow, which connects to 2 other books you've written about the kind of transatlantic fallout of the English Civil Wars and then the Western design. So he is in many ways the perfect foil for someone like Bradford, who stays in Plymouth and making his way through all these major events elsewhere. So I think we may have our first question. Zenka, you want to take over as moderator?
Yes, I will be taking over. And yes, we do have a first question. I was just wanting to say that I'm very pleased to know that Cape Cod was always a, you know, a quiet fishing place with lots of bad parties, you know, and drunken parties, which is what it still has today. So that's, you know, there's a tradition that was already, you know, getting established back then. So yes, we do have the first 2 questions.
I am a medievalist, so I'm but somebody who's always been interested in colonial history generally. I was intrigued by the comment about the isolation and the choice, it would appear, of the historians and whoever else was writing the story of Plymouth Plantation later, and how were they ignoring all of the evidence to the contrary that it was not isolated, or is it that your research has revealed how unisolated it was, and therefore they're not, and if they are ignoring it, was that for a purpose that answers in later American history that I don't know about, or was it that they did the best with what there was, and now we're correcting it?
well, Plymouth begins to be a site of commemoration and memory even before the United States is founded. The residents decide they're going to start emphasizing the firstness of Plymouth, and that's when they settle on the rock and they drag it around and break it, and you know, which is a weird thing to have happen to something that was supposed to mark a landing site. Like, you find it and then you immediately move it. Just seems to me super counterintuitive. I picture drunken young men of a frat party variety, you know, deciding this is a good idea, that they're going to hook it up to something and drag it somewhere else. And, but as it over time, it becomes, you know, different elements of it get emphasized, but sort of an underlying message that the early commemorators want to emphasize is that they were all alone in New England, far away from England, without anyone to help them. Half of them die in the first winter, and they arrive too late in the season and it's already cold. And so this idea of suffering and sacrifice becomes, which is envisioned as them being isolated, becomes part of the narrative really early. And there's lots of 19th century prints and paintings that emphasize the wintry landscape and et cetera, et cetera. So I think, the way it gets commemorated, the way it becomes part of popular memory really emphasizes that isolation. And so that's, I think, is part of it. But in terms of were the records there, I would say the records were always there, but no one ever cared.
Okay.
Like if you're looking for a connectedness, it's easy to see, but that's not what other people were looking for. So I think that really explains to a great extent why, as soon as I thought, what if you think about it as a well-connected place? And, I just saw different things that other people haven't seen. It's, and I think most historians who've written about Plymouth, the ones I've talked to since I produced this book, certainly, and others I would assume as well, if I said to them, they would say, well, of course it was. Like, how could it not be? But I think, to make a point of that and to think about how that worked, I think is probably what the contribution is here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
How do you address Governor Bradford's decision to change communal agricultural arrangements to private plots?
So that wasn't actually just Bradford's decision. Let me explain this to people who don't maybe know all the details. But what happens when they first arrive is they agree that they are going to work together to meet their own personal needs and to produce whatever it is they're going to produce to send back to England to pay off the big debt that they incurred getting the ship and all the supplies and getting themselves to where they were. So they come with a debt, as do, I mean, no effort like this is accomplished without somebody putting in a lot of money. and they don't have a company backing them, or what they have is a group of private investors who are basically loaning them the money, but are expecting to both be repaid and make a profit. So they initially communally build houses and start, farming and doing whatever other activities they can come up with that is going to make them money. It quickly becomes clear they're not going to immediately find something that they can load onto a ship that's going to make the investors happy. It's going to end up being furs, but that's going to be tricky to sort that out. So that's going to take a little bit of time, because they're not hunters, and they're going to have to develop relationships with the local natives and get, what are we going to pay them with, and how are we going to arrange this? So it's something that takes them a while, but more people start arriving, and it becomes controversial or questionable whether people who arrive in the second and third wave of arrivals owe the debt. Does everybody owe the debt? Is it just the first group that came that owes the debt? What if you come and you're living off of other people's effort? Are you part of this debt? So very quickly resentments start to build, and there starts to be tension about, is everybody working toward paying off this debt together or what? So they decide as a group that they will divide up the land that they've put under cultivation and assign it to individual households who will then be responsible to cultivate their own crops, take care of their own. So more along the lines of what they would have done in England, but that a group that is in control of the situation will have exclusive rights to the fur trade, which they've now by this time set up. And that this group will trade with the natives and send the furs back to England in order to pay off the debt. So this group becomes responsible for managing. They create a monopoly of the fur trade, and then they put it all in the hands of this group of men, which includes Bradford, Winslow, Atherton, others. And they just say, these people are going to have exclusive right to trade with the natives, and all the fur that comes through the colony is going to go to paying off the debt. So the decision is to kind of separate the subsistence agriculture piece of this, making it individual private property responsibility, and the how are we going to pay off the debt piece of this, which they didn't do right at the beginning, but they do it a little while into it. It was funny to me reading more deeply about Plymouth that that moment of supposedly giving up communism and switching to private property has been hugely controversial in the writing about Plymouth, that there were like socialists in the 19th century that were commending Plymouth for having tried this. And then, you know, Christian socialists saying, well, this is just Christianity and everybody should be doing this. And then, you know, Cold Warriors in the 1950s who are livid that anyone would suggest that these people ever did this. So there's actually a very interesting thread running through the commentary on this policy because of concerns about, you know, were they briefly communist, or should we celebrate them because they were briefly communist?
I mean, there's something there for the Cold Warriors too, which is that they do away with it. And there's this line that gets quoted where Bradford says, this proved Plato's Republic wrong because the utopia of communal property didn't work. But the other thing that Carla didn't mention that she does in the book with this anecdote is that the wives are such an important part of the decision. Do you want to explain that briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I love this part of Bradford because, okay, so for those of you who haven't read of Plymouth Plantation, and there's a fabulous new edition, a scholarly edition of it actually with really good annotation if you're interested, that came out for the anniversary. But if you haven't read it, it's divided into two books. And the first book creates the story of fleeing England and going to the Netherlands, and it gives a kind of Christian history framework for understanding, and it's the kind of the basis of the we came here to practice our religion narrative that's become so central to the understanding of Plymouth. And he's writing that very intentionally to the younger generation within the colony, saying, don't forget your roots, this is where we come from, you know, be sure you know this story. And then he just goes into, you know, discussing things that happened, you know, kind of day to day, and, you know, events in the colony is part two. It becomes very, you know, fragmented in terms of narrative, and it doesn't really have an underlying point in the end. It just becomes life. But when he's describing what goes on in the early colony, he says, well, they decided because they arrived so late in the year, they're going to just build a few structures to house everybody because they're sick of being on the ship. And it's cold and they want to get on land, but they would need to be inside. And so they decide they will build, in effect, as many buildings as there are adult women who are wives. And the logic of this is you need a wife, you need an adult woman with a certain skill set to run a household. So if you take every wife and put her in a building with her family, then she can do like the cooking, the cleaning, you know, she can mend the clothing, et cetera, et cetera. But then they have all these extra men who are not attached to households. They're not servants of the male head of household. They're not children. They're just random additional men. And then, so they decide they will sort those men into the family households so that the wives with the skills can also take care of them, because they can't be expected to cook and, you know, mend their clothes and all of that because they don't have those skills. So basically, without asking the women, they do this. And then there's a little revolt. And Bradford's quite amazed. Like he didn't expect this. So, you know, I use that to talk about kind of the gender division of labor and various other, you know, the essential, you know, the importance of having these women there. It's also the reason why people remarry very quickly, generally speaking. If you don't have female servants in your household and you lose your wife, you're suddenly not able to function, you know, just on a day-to-day basis, you know. So I use it to talk about that, but it's also very much about these kind of communal decisions that are being made about how are we going to get through this first couple of years. You know, like, let's save the male labor of building too many houses, and let's not really think about what that means for the female labor of having to manage the houses that we do build with the additional, you know, people in each one. So
Helen Deutsch.
This has been so much fun, and it's so great to see everyone. And Carla, I can't wait to read your book. So this is kind of a question about the form of the anecdote, because that's something that I've written about and thought a lot about. And I thought, as I've been thinking about how, Alex, you described the book, Joel Feynman has this great term for the anecdote, and he calls it the historeme, where it's like the smallest possible unit of narrative out of which history can be built, and it can be detached from a larger narrative context and moved into new context, and thereby create new narrative. And so it seems like the anecdote remains really important to you in your book, but that you're also kind of pushing against some of the anecdotes that we all know and trying to kind of think about different anecdotes, or maybe use anecdote a little differently. So I just wonder, I mean, you already told that great story about the wives, which is fantastic, but could you maybe give us another little taste of what you do with anecdote in the book? Like, I keep hearing about these stockings, but I don't know.
okay. I love the stockings. And Rinka thinks I should show you that I'm wearing red stockings, but I will.
You are?
I will
That's
not
great.
actually. Completely unintentionally, I currently today happen to be wearing red stockings.
That's great. Okay.
So the stockings. Okay, so we have this image of everybody in Plymouth wearing gray and black and brown, which is incorrect. And in fact, black is very expensive to produce. So, like, that is actually not an easy thing to wear. And to be a minister who wears black with a white collar is to make a big statement. But so they're wearing colors anyway, which was something I knew would surprise some readers. But then I ran across this story in the court records of a man who was brought, the grand jury actually presents him for wearing red stockings, you know, and the men and women both wear stockings. And everybody has seen him in these red stockings. And his neighbors know he doesn't own red stockings and that there hasn't been a way to acquire red stockings. And so they present him, and then he's called in by the magistrate, and he says, well, yes, he found them. This is after Boston has been founded in 1630. So it's about 10 years into Plymouth's history. And he had been visiting Boston, and he saw these stockings drying on a windowsill. And he took them and he carried them back to Plymouth, and then he put him on. And so his neighbors basically catch him at this, knowing that he doesn't have these stockings and therefore he can't be wearing them. And he is ordered by the magistrate to return to Boston and return the stockings. Like, basically, there's no other evidence that there's a punishment. It's just, you have to humiliate yourself by going back to Boston and, telling the person whose house you took it off the windowsill that you have their stockings and that you're returning them. But I use that in the book to talk about how all the clothes they're wearing are coming from England. The material to produce the clothes, clothing and shoes are a big part of what they import after they arrive. And they're very worried about what they're going to wear. They don't want to adopt native attire because that has a whole other set of issues surrounding it. But they don't actually have that much opportunity to adopt native attire. It's not like native peoples are volunteering to provide this to them. So they have moments in the history, in the early years of Plymouth, where they don't have anything to wear, and shoes show up, and a ship shows up with shoes and they basically have to distribute them to everybody right there, because people don't have, at that point, their shoes have been wearing out and they don't have shoes. So I use this to talk about their dependence on these kinds of imports, and their how slow they are to create local industries, either for linen or wool or whatever, and how it's a very long time before they're actually able to provide these things for themselves. So we think of the homespun movement in the American Revolutionary period as a kind of return to an earlier era when they were making their own clothes. But in fact, before that era, they were completely dependent on imports. And they also use the cloth that they import increasingly in their trade with the natives for the furs. So then that becomes more important from that point of view as well. So, I use it as a way to talk about, the rarity of these items and the fact that they have to be imported. And therefore, if you have 2 pairs of stockings, all your neighbors know what those stockings are, what colors they are, whatever. I mean, and there's a couple things in the records where somebody sends, a man who's a Londoner, who's one of the investors, writes to Bradford and says he's enclosing stockings from his wife to Bradford's wife in the package that he sends him. So, these things are circulating, and they take on a new importance when you're in Plymouth, where you can't get them. So that's an example of how I use one of the anecdotes.
So
I can quickly tell the one about the chickens, which might be my favorite. So they have to bring domestic farm animals if they're going to create the same kind of foodways and farming experience that they have. And, there's debate about, they talk about when they finally import cattle, etc. But early on, they probably just bring goats and chickens, because those are the most portable. And so there's a moment when Edward Winslow and John Hampden, who's a visitor, a tourist, possibly the famous John Hampden, but this is debated, go to the bedside of Massasoit, who's the leader of the local native group that they've had most contact with. He's ill, and they go to visit him. And Winslow decides that he's going to try to heal Massasoit, and what he needs is chicken broth. So he actually sends back to Plymouth to get chicken. And a native runner goes through the countryside to Plymouth with a note from Winslow and gets a couple chickens and runs them back. By the time he gets back, Massasoit is already much improved by Winslow's own interventions in his healthcare, according to Winslow at least. And so then the native leader is like, "Can I keep the chickens?" And then it becomes a question of like, what is he going to do with them? Is he going to incorporate them into his local diet, into the diet? Is it going to become a status object? So, I use that story, which is interesting for a lot of different reasons, to talk about the kind of movement of these animals across the Atlantic, and how they become part of making New England into an English place where English people can live in a way that's familiar to them.
So Alex, did you want to add something to this?
I was just going to say, yeah, very briefly so this example of trade, both importing and exporting, it fits with these other kind of bigger concepts that Carla deals with in the book, like when she takes up the issue of religious separatism and argues that, in fact, the separatism of the Plymouth settlers has been exaggerated, and that they were fairly comfortable with Church of England relations over that big distance. The same thing happens in her discussion of kingship, that, the Plymouth settlers who have been made out to be kind of proto-American revolutionaries were constantly citing their loyalty to the king and using him as a justification for their colonizing activities, and invoking him to describe themselves as sort of his emissaries when they hadn't really been, deputized to do so. So these are all, I think, actually answers to Susanna's original question about why folks in the 19th century thought this was a good place to kind of locate the origins of the United States, that the isolation, which made us blind to all of those aspects of Plymouth culture, made them look like national American, United States citizens in their turning away from monarchy, a certain kind of religion that's about freedom more so than dependence on an institutional structure, that kind of thing. So I think that was the big motivation. And then maybe for another day, we can talk about the connection to slavery, which is not absent, but is certainly less pronounced than a place like Jamestown that actually has historical priority on Plymouth, but is not so often pinpointed as the birthplace of the nation. But we have more questions.
Yes, we do. We have a bit of a debate in the chat between Susanna Baxendale, who says, did they need to attract people with skills like weaving or processing flax, for example, in order to even consider being more self-sufficient? And then Sharon King commenting, the other aspect of that, issues of supply chain delays, right? So
Right.
which one is it? Is it objects or is it
Well,
people?
the original 100 people that come on the Mayflower are about half people from the Separatist church in Leiden and half people who are collected because they have skills. So they're already thinking like, we need a blacksmith, we need, you know, so they gather, they recruit people from England itself who join with certain skills. And those people, you know, unfortunately, with half the 100 dying in the first winter, you know, they're then, you know, big steps back in terms of what they have covered, you know, in terms of skills that people have. So they do, I mean, they do know they're importing things. They're trying to get their investors to send them things. The investors abandon them fairly quickly, like 5 years or so into it, and basically withdraw from supporting them. But until they are, you know, until they withdraw, leaving them in the hands of a smaller number of men who stick with them, they are sending them things that they need, but also always saying like, what are you going to send us? Like, we need to get some return on our investment. So supply chain makes it sound more organized, I think, than it is, but they do definitely rely on imported items that are sent to them.
Teo Ruiz?
Sorry about this. I have not read your book yet, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and if you discuss that in the book, attempts by the settlers to convert the natives' view of this settlers' religion, and vice versa.
Yeah, there's some really fascinating material about this that is generated in the documents. You know, they spend a lot of time, in particular with Squanto, and at the time that he dies, he says to them, you know, I hope you'll commend me to the Englishman's God. And they're surprised. Like, they've clearly not had this conversation with him. They've clearly not made the effort to convert him. So it's quite odd to me the way, and you know, this is generally true of people who go to early America. If you stay in England, you are a big supporter of converting the natives. If you actually go to America and live among natives, the priority for that drops way off. So it's not untypical that people, once they're actually there, don't do much about it. But they do have conversations. They have conversations about God and about the providential thinking of the English, you know, so you can see they're having exchanges of understanding to the extent that they're able, back and forth between the two groups. But there's not a real concerted effort to convert. The really great thing about this is Squanto was for a while in the hands of the Dominicans in Spain. So he is no doubt been baptized as a Catholic, but they never note that or think about it, or and they are so vehemently anti-Catholic. Like, they have a fairly benign reputation religiously in general, like as compared to the people in Massachusetts Bay or other places. But until you get to their anti-Catholicism, and then they are just collecting all the books about Pope Joan, and you know, they're completely anti-Catholic. So it's interesting to think about the fact that Squanto was probably baptized and that they never cottoned on to that.
I've put in a question in the chat, so I'm going to call on myself. So in what language were these conversations? I'm really interested.
Well, the interesting thing is they don't have any interactions with the native peoples who they've seen at a distance for a period of time until a man, Samoset, walks into their village and says in not very good English that he is visiting them to let them know that there is in fact a native man from the area who is up in the north, but who they've sent for. And that when he arrives, he will be able to speak English. And that is Squanto. So they are actually talking in English, which, because Squanto, after he was in Spain, where he was taken by an English trader who kidnapped a number of native men off the coast of Massachusetts, he was taken to Spain to be sold as a slave in Spain. And in Spain, the Dominicans realized that these are people who have been brought from the Americas, and that since all the Americas belong to Spain, and all the people in the Americas, unless they've made war on the king's forces, are vassals of the king, they cannot be sold as slaves. So the Dominicans grab as many of them as they can and get them out of being enslaved. And then Squanto goes from there, eventually making his way to England. And in England, he learns English as he's trying to get on board some ship that will go back to New England. And he makes at least one journey as far as like Newfoundland with the fishing fleet before he gets far enough to like be in like the main area where he can then get off the ship and make his way down the coast to his native village, which it, you know, no longer has people living in it because of the disease that went through the area after he left. So the native village is gone because of the disease. And then later when the Plymouth people arrive, they settle on the village site of his family. So they take over Pawtuxet, which is already, you know, prepared for habitation because it had been used seasonally by these native families that would come down to the coast at a certain time of the year. So he's basically coming back to the site of his native village in order to be the interpreter for the local native leader, using the English that he acquired because he had been kidnapped by Thomas Hunt, who was a captain of a ship that had previously stopped in the area. So it's a fascinating story.
It's really fascinating indeed. I think some people have left, but there was one last question from Susanna Baxendale. So for those of you who have to go, please, thank you for joining us, but please feel free to go. And the question was, if I can just locate it in the chat. Yes, was there any expression at the time of emulating early Christians when they were living more communally? So I think that there was the reference, right, when we were talking about the Christian socialists. So was there any reference to the early Christians?
In the original sources, they don't actually talk about that one way or another. They just say, we decided not to do it that way anymore. We switched to handing out the land to individual families and handing the debt over to this group of 8 or 10 men, I think, who were going to be in charge of paying it off.
So there's
we don't have as many religious records. Like, you know, we have one sermon that was preached in Plymouth, and the elder who runs the church for the first 10 plus years, he, you know, none of all his books survive. He had a magnificent book collection. His books survive, but his own writings of letters or anything like that, we have nothing of that sort.
Yeah, so theological primitivists, but not thinking maybe that way economically. So it's more, I think, a practical thing. Because the other thing we haven't mentioned is that they arrive in the wrong place. That's a big part of the story, is that they're supposed to be heading a little further south. And then they have to make do in the winter in this colder climate. So
yeah, they're trying to go to some place like Delaware, which would have been Northern Virginia at the time.
Maybe more of them would have survived that first winter. I wanted to ask you, Alex, a question. Maybe we can conclude with that. But given your work on innovation, did you see any of that dichotomy that you're talking about in your work in Carla's book.
Yeah. So Bradford's Plymouth Plantation is currently in the book manuscript draft, the opening anecdote of the entire book. And I read a moment when he describes a rebellious colonist as an innovator, as kind of a classic instance of the usage of that word in this very foreign pejorative sense that we no longer have. And then I tease out from there sort of what the argument was about and how the Plymouth colonists are trying to position the many things that they're doing that are not exact replications of English culture, politically, religiously, whatever, as nonetheless legitimate in the face of this other form of change, right? So they're sort of mutually accusing each other of innovating. And they go round and round. But the interesting thing, I guess, the connection with Carla's book is there's so much emphasis here on replicating English lifeways and trying to figure out if agricultural can work the same, that sort of adaptation of putting the single men in the households with women as a version of this, trying, but always failing at least slightly to replicate the old ways that you're familiar with, and having this anxiety that's often kind of beneath the surface, but occasionally bubbles up in these expressions using that word or a cognate like novelty or new, if things, you know, get a little uglier and someone's in trouble for their innovation. I see that in a lot of places. So yeah, so I think Carla's story is a little bit less politically centered than mine about these actual controversies over theology or governance, but very much taking up these questions of whether you can really recreate the old world in the new, and growing increasingly comfortable with the fact that you can't and that you have to adapt at least at some level. So.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you. This was really fun, you know, especially post Thanksgiving.
Yes, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Alex for the discussion.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out on Zoom this evening, and thank you, Carla, so much, and thank you, Alex.
Thank you
for joining us. Bye-bye.
All right, take care, everyone.